None of them understood whether Ray had already completed his ritual or not yet. But isn't that impressive? After all, the ceremony can begin right now, since Marcus Hilord himself personally insisted on this. His son came closer to him and asked if his father really wanted to see him. He was visibly upset because he needed to have a pretty serious conversation with his son. So he asked him if he had heard about the new saint who could summon meteorites. He simply has to win him over to his side. He patted him on the shoulder and said that now this is definitely their chance that cannot be missed. After that, he leaned closer to him and said that they had already lost a saint, so if they could gain the favor of a new saint, that would be just wonderful. In this way, they will be able to strengthen the influence of their family on the Holy Kingdom, which could not but please the eldest son of the Marquis Hilord, whose name is Berit. Therefore, his father ordered him to make sure that they could get along well during the banquet, and he should also remember to treat him with the utmost respect, regardless of his true age. He once again emphasized this, ordering that special attention be paid to these factors so as not to become his personal enemy. After they parted, the guy smiled and told his father that there was no need to worry so much. He had already heard that he was a simple guy from the village who was nothing of himself. It was night outside, so he sat and began to think about how he needed to beat everything. Everyone in the castle was already walking around and discussing the new saint. Many people conveyed information about his strength and majesty to the masses. But is he really a simple person and not a saint at all? He's really lucky to have been chosen and to climb this high. It's an amazing, life-changing opportunity. The nobles kept laughing at this and asked if they should teach him some basic manners. Count Train seemed to have seen something and closed his eyes to take a better look and analyze the situation. He saw that same man and was very scared. Besides, his partner was no longer laughing at all. Barrett really began to worry because he had never appeared at banquets before. Why did he decide to do it now? It was the Duke of Trey named Zeke, who came here with a not very happy look. He looked quite pumped up and seemed to be looking for something, as he looked around vigilantly while the rest of the people in the room greeted him. Barrett smiled, although he was very worried, but still began a dialogue, saying that he could not even imagine that people from Treya would be here. But he looked at him with the coldest possible gaze, making it clear that he had absolutely no time for this, because he did not come here to admire Berit. Hearing this phrase, the girl began to laugh and asked who he was considering then. Her name is Marquise Krellin. He came to see Ray, so he asked if he had already come here or if he was not there yet. The Marquise understood that most likely he had not yet met the saint. Barrett laughed and said that he would arrive soon, so it would be nice to wait for him together. Zeke began to suspect that he might have something urgent to do because he left them in a great hurry, and Berit simply continued to try to extract as much information as possible from the lips of his interlocutor. And Zeke continued to scream and scold the guy, because he was completely shameless, even though he wasn't here. Flowers still continued to stand near his room, and Ray wondered if all this was really made especially for him. This is very convenient, because it seems that everything was sewn based on his tastes and preferences. But how did they guess about it? The new uniform suits him very well. Ray didn't understand how she was able to determine his measurements so accurately, and the maid said that she took measurements on the day of his arrival and sent them to the tailor, so she should have fit him perfectly. He smiled because with enough practice, absolutely anyone can accurately determine the size. So when they first met, he realized that she was amazing, but she turned out to be even much cooler than he expected. She showed absolutely no emotion and just stood there without much interest or desire. But still, after that, out of politeness, she thanked the guy and said that she would take him to the banquet hall. Ray laughed and said that he would not refuse such a thing, but he still could not believe that the girl had absolutely no reaction to his statements and jokes. A lot of people had already gathered in the living room, and everyone was waiting for the start of the event. Or rather, for its most important guest. The nobles saw Rei and began to discuss that he came much later than he promised, so the girl began to calm him down, because perhaps he needed time to get ready. Therefore, she decided to defuse the situation a little and asked if they had heard what happened during the ritual. Yes, but not in detail. So Barrett told him that Rei inspired everyone with his speech. But still he laughed, because he is nothing more than a simple person. After this phrase, he was a little scared because the butler asked everyone present for a moment of attention, since a new saint had just arrived here. Rei looked like a real emperor and fully corresponded to his image of a saint. A smile reigned on his face, and he was accompanied by an equally beautiful girl who seemed to be plotting something further. All the people began to be surprised, because many of those present had not yet seen him, so they began to discuss among themselves that they had imagined him completely differently. But such a small boy emanated great confidence and calm. Barrett immediately ran up to him and said that he was the eldest son of Marquis Hilord. So Rei smiled and said that he was very pleased to meet the members of the Hilord family, and it was also a great honor for him. The son was starting to get nervous, because he didn't see Rei make even one mistake. At that moment, Rei continued to stand confidently and introduce himself to all the guests present, continuing to say that he was honored by all of this. He began to panic, because at this rate all his plans could collapse greatly, and he would have to suffer punishment from his father. So he began to try to take control of the situation, because he had heard before that Rei was a common man, so he needed to strike back to prove himself. Rei replied that he was from a small village, which is located near the kingdom of Cilia, so Barrett straightened his arms and assumed that in this case, Rei was attending such a banquet for the first time. But still, he thought to himself that it was unacceptable for a simple person to start come to such events. He couldn't come to terms with this, but Rei smiled and seemed to read his thoughts, because he immediately replied that it was really his first time at such a celebration. As Barrett said, truly ordinary people are not allowed to such banquets. Saints are not commoners, so this does not apply to you. At such banquets there is nothing for any mediocrity to do. Yes, there are people like him everywhere. They cannot come to terms with the fact that others have something that they do not have, so they cannot just quietly and calmly watch from the sidelines and behave tactlessly, trying to interfere in the affairs of others. Indeed, some people are simply worse than trash. Rei smiled again and said that Barrett seemed to really believe that status determined a person's worth. But that was just common sense. What these people have in common is that they end up digging their own graves. Rei looked at him and said that he was not at all used to such a life, so it was difficult for him to understand them. But Barrett understood that it was better not to be rude, and also said that he had already forgotten what they were talking about. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the guy began to continue to be bombarded with questions that he was not quite ready to listen to, let alone answer. But Barrett continued to stand his ground and said that Rei was a commoner in the past. Therefore, he took a sword from his holster and decided to swing it sharply. It seems he decided to attack the guy. Rei was shocked because this was his first banquet, and he was already receiving similar behavior in his direction. The ground near the arches began to shake, and an unpleasant sound of a sword whistling was heard throughout the area. Behind Barrett stood Zeke, who came to this event for a reason, holding his sword to the guy. Seeing this situation, Barrett was very frightened and started screaming. He really started to have a strong panic. Rei wasn't ready to see it either, so he started yelling and reprimanding Zeke, asking him why he was doing this. Isn't it dangerous? It's good that he stopped the sword with his mana, so Zeke decided to apologize for such an act. He apologizes for making such a bad first impression on him, so he immediately fell to his knees and bowed his head, causing the guy to feel misunderstood. But Zeke just wanted to let him know that he couldn't let that idiot humiliate the guy. Even though he knew it was rude, he couldn't hold back any longer. He looked at Ray and simply continued to ask for forgiveness, but he was shocked because he did not understand what he was doing. His servant also asked Ray for the opportunity to compliment, since everything that Berit from the family of Marquis Hilord said was blasphemy. So she also did not understand how he could allow himself to make Ray look like a fool. Zeke jumped at the opportunity, saying that they must destroy him and ensure that the family was punished accordingly. Hearing this, he was very scared, but they continued to discuss it, saying that this would serve as an excellent example for others. Ray agreed and asked Euclid to call Marquis Hilord, so she ran quickly to carry out this instruction. But Iriella interrupted her, saying that there was no need to run anywhere, since he was here and saw everything himself from the second floor. The father began to insult his son, and he was shocked and did not know how to properly apologize. Therefore, he himself could not stand it and was the first to hit his son with his hand, calling him a complete idiot. He continued to beat him for several minutes, and also did not stop his insults at all, because he seemed to have forgotten what order his father had given him. What right does he have to treat a saint like that? Everyone was shocked when they saw this picture, where a father beat his son for several minutes for such behavior. So no one even intervened, but simply watched, thinking about whether it was worth stopping him or not. The father began to ostentatiously fall to his knees, offering his deepest apologies, ordering his son to do the same, because all this happened because he raised him poorly. He looked at Boris and continued to shout at him, ordering him to immediately apologize for his behavior, so he even began to stutter a little from fear. The maid and Zeke in the background were discussing this whole situation, and sincerely did not understand how he dared to say such a thing in the presence of a saint. So Zeke also offered his help, saying that he could punish him properly. Ray was already annoyed by this, so he asked everyone to stop swearing and calm down, and began to think about how he could stop it. He looked at his father, who was no less frightened, and then asked what he thought would be the best punishment for his son. The Marquis clenched his teeth and became noticeably nervous, and cold sweat began to pour down his body. He said that Boris lost his mother at a fairly early age, and he should have raised him as a good father. He was upset because he didn't want him to have the same life as him, so he had to give him a good life without flaws, making it his personal promise. Therefore, he looked at the guy and said that if there was such an opportunity for him to forgive him the first time for such unreasonable actions, in exchange for this, as expected, he would renounce his title and donate his fortune to the temple. But shouldn't the punishment only affect his son? How can a parent not correct his child's mistake? Ray was very surprised because the father is really going to give up his title right now because of his son. He quietly called Barris, who stood up in panic and waited for what Ray would tell him. He continued to kneel in front of all the guests of this palace, so Ray asked if he realized his mistake. Therefore, Barris agreed that he really spoke blasphemous words to him. But Ray was very kind today, because if the father was the same as his son, he would also punish Marquis Hallard for such behavior. But apparently, he is a completely different person. It's not all. Boris's biggest mistake is that because of him, his father has to kneel in the presence of all the guests. Ray smiled and said that he was thinking about his punishment, but because of the sincerity of his father, who seems to really love him very much, he will turn a blind eye to it for the first time and have mercy on him. Therefore, he made it clear that he no longer held a grudge against them and forgave them both, which greatly surprised the maid and Zeke, who seemed clearly shocked by this behavior. The Marquis began to have tears in his eyes, so he began to ask if he was really ready to forgive them. Would he really just not take any action? Ray began to laugh, saying that this is all on the condition that they actually donate money, as they themselves mentioned earlier. The Marquis began to apologize and say that he would donate any necessary amount. And Iriel watched the situation and laughed, because this is really a very light punishment for such sins. But still, she hoped that he had thought it over and realized his mistakes. At night, they approached Ray and asked if he really thought it was worth forgiving him. Zeke said that if the saint gave an order, he would immediately take care of them. But he was already tired of these questions, because why did this blue-haired guy pick on him? Ray stopped and really became a little aggressive, because he realized that the guy was following him practically all the way. It's even strange that he himself didn't pay attention to it. He looked at Zeke and said that even in all this time, he had not asked his name. Without hesitation, he also fell to his knees and said that he had committed a really terrible sin and began to apologize. But Ray just wanted to know his name, so he introduced himself again, saying that his name was Trey Zeke, and he was from the Trey family. Ray looked at him and said that the maid also had Sai after her last name. But what does that mean? Sai is a title. People who have Sai in their name serve the saints, and this shows their devotion to them. But why is this so important to so many people? The guy smiled, because he does not at all think that all three families should serve him, and in general it sounds quite funny. She was serious and reprimanded him, since this is a tradition that they have followed since ancient times. Please don't feel burdened by this. It's just the will of God. So Zeke said that if Ray thinks 3 families is too many, then let him just choose him alone, and he will do everything in his power. The maid was surprised and noticeably angry with him, so Ray calmed her down, saying that he would not force anyone to leave, and there was no need to fight about this. He looked at them and asked what about the 3rd family, because there are only 2 of them now, but the 3rd ensures the safety of the saint from the shadows. Their real identity is not even known to the Holy Kingdom. Therefore, they themselves don't even know who they are, which really surprised the guy. Besides, they know anyway that they are always there to protect him. Ray was very surprised at one moment, as something very strange flashed before his eyes. He looked at the tree and didn't understand how this was possible. She was right. They were indeed there. So now that he knew of their existence, he could sense their mana and use it for his own purposes. He began to count them all in order, as an X-ray was formed in his eyes, which captured these ultraviolet indicators. Ray began to scream because he counted 7 at once, but the maid simply continued to stand with a stone face, absolutely not surprised by anything. She asked Zeke if he felt anything, but he also didn't feel anything. At that moment, strange voices began to be heard from the tree, which were barely audible. A girl was sitting on him, who, despite his young age, realized that Ray was really a magician, which was very impressive. The next morning, the saint had a lot of tasks, especially after such a difficult night, where he learned so many discoveries for himself. At the castle, the first work processes began with Miss Euclidwood, who greeted the staff. After which, she came closer to the picture with swords and thought about her past. She remembered how they shouted at her and ordered her to get up immediately, because she is from the Belacroix family. So if she can't even do this, then she definitely doesn't deserve to bear the name Belacroix. The girl was still very young, so she asked her father for forgiveness for this. But he said that the one who would serve the saint could not be weak in any way. So he ordered her to take the sword, because there had never been such a case that 2 saints existed at the same time, given that they already have a saint. Then there definitely should not have been saints in this generation. However, in order to serve a saint who does not even exist, does she have to suffer like this now? But years later, God answered her question by choosing another saint. But this process was interrupted by Ray, who forced the girl to open her eyes and come out of this state, calling her name. He asked if Iriel would actually lead the next ritual, but what does that mean? She was pleased because she had said more than once that the ceremony would be performed by a divinely beautiful woman. Euclid was serious, so she said that if Ray allowed, she would explain everything to him, because except for special cases, only saints can enter the ceremony hall, so it has nothing to do with appearance. He was surprised, so he asked Iriel if this was really so, and did she really think it was funny? They went out to walk through the forest, and he felt very pleased to be outside for such a long period of time, because he didn't even know that there was a forest here. It reminded him of the time when he sat and studied magic as a child. But the memories did not last long, as Iriel reported that they had already arrived at the right place. Wait, there are knights here, but is there a need for such protection? So this really is the place. Ray was really excited because he didn't understand where they had come from and why there were so many guards. Uriel showed him the steps that rose very high into the sky, saying that this is where the entrance is. She looked at the guy and said that they just need to go up all the way. Uriel smiled because this part of the ceremony is meant to show his respect for God, so he won't be allowed to use magic. What? This is really too cruel. It really started to get dark outside very quickly. Ray was beginning to suspect something, so he asked Iriel to stop and wait, especially since he wanted to rest a little. What would he do without it? She smiled, because they had just begun their journey. Was he really tired so quickly? Looks like someone here is having trouble with stamina. But he denied it, because all this was due to the fact that all yesterday evening, the guy walked around the kingdom, talking with people, which the girl herself knows. Therefore, it is logical to guess that he no longer has the strength to continue to walk so much. Especially since he is not allowed to use magic, thanks to which there would be no problems at all to get to the highest point of these steps. But she raised her hand and reminded him once again that she had already informed him that from now on, they should not use magic, and at the ceremony site, it would also be unacceptable. She showed him the road and told him that he had to go all this way on his own, so let him follow the stars and thus get to the desired point. But she once again emphasized that magic should not be used under any circumstances. Ray looked at these steps and wanted to turn back, but the girl encouraged him and believed that he could handle it. And he also understood that he had already gone far enough and could not give up so easily. After some time, he stopped and looked at the sky, and his whole face was sweating since the guy was able to overcome all this path. He was exhausted, so he fell to the ground to at least somehow rest, and also did not understand what he was thinking about. Agreeing to this? After all, it took much longer than he expected. But his melancholy did not last long, because in front of him he saw a beautiful house. Because initially he assumed that there would be a completely empty area. Without further hesitation, he went into it and opened the entrance doors, asking if anyone was here and saying that it looked like he would need to spend 7 days in this place. Iriel also said that he will need to show respect for God, but he doesn't even know what he needs to do, because the girl told him that she hasn't done anything all week. Ray smiled, because he began to perceive this mission as a kind of vacation. Therefore, he went outside to take a closer look at the house and realized that he would have a good rest there, especially since the week would pass very quickly indeed. Only then did he not know about all the trials that were prepared for him, and the harsh reality that he would have to face during his stay in this place. He took the apple out of the tree, glad that they were fresh enough. Immediately after this, he decided to eat them, since for such a long period of stress on the body, Ray became quite hungry. He was very happy because thanks to these apples he was able to eat. But after a second, his mood changed greatly. He began to throw them on the ground, because of them, he was poisoned. And this is very cruel. Ray began to panic and get angry, because even in order to make fire, he had to take a stick, because he promised that he would not use mana, so he had to do everything with his own hands. But how can he survive here? Why didn't anyone tell him anything about this, since even cooking fish is already very difficult? Isn't his suffering enough for them? In the evening, he still managed to light a fire, but he still continued to analyze their words, where they promised only 1 week, and that it would all last no more than 7 days. But why has he been here for more than a month? Ray was simply furious. It became very unpleasant for him to realize this. All he wanted was to at least find out what was happening here. He started waving his fish and asking if they really decided to make a savage out of him. So he started waving his arms and realized that he no longer had the desire to be a saint. But something stopped him. He was shocked because he did not understand what kind of feeling it was. All this magic happening because he just got angry? Ray waved his hands and was furious. Magical mana, which is given to all saints, began to run through his body, thanks to which it lifted him several meters above the ground. Finally, the process of his transformation began and divine power came to him. He began to fly like a real superhero, but such happiness did not last long. Ray stopped and began to panic. Because where did his power go? She simply disappeared, but what should he do then? Luckily, she appeared a few seconds later, making a little joke with the guy. From now on, everything will be for real. Or not? His mana disappeared again, and his strength disappeared, so he began to get angry, not understanding what was happening right now. A second later, a huge flurry of mana fell on him, which completely pierced his body, and he finally began to feel it. But then he was lowered to the ground again, and all the power disappeared, forcing the guy to stand in bewilderment. He did not understand what was happening. So he wanted to know the answer to this question because is God himself now playing with him? A very bright glare of the sun appeared in the sky, which seemed to be the answer to his question. A moment later, a huge charge of magic formed from it again, which again flew towards the guy. He was already very angry because he did not understand what these senseless actions were, since he had been here for a whole month, and the power had not come to him. Therefore, he began to run away, asking God to leave all this, since he no longer had the strength, and there was no point in this, because mana appears and disappears. He was already panicking, because this is even more annoying, because he feels how the air around is filled with divine power, and it immediately disappears. He has never been so upset. What kind of mockery is this? As soon as he thought about someone comforting him, Ariel appeared next to him, who seemed to have appeared here for a reason. Ray was happy, because even though the first person he met a month later was Ariel, he was still very happy, because perhaps this only meant that he could leave here today. But that's what Ariel saw. She didn't understand what was happening with the guy and how she could help him. After all this, they had a dialogue where the girl asked whether Ray really claims that he can use both magic and holy power. But he replied that he had not tried magic yet. He was also very surprised, because what happened to her clothes? She replied that she felt a strong divine power and ran to him in a hurry, and also said that the ritual was now over. Ray looked at the girl and said that he needed to cleanse her, which he actually did by using magic. He smiled, because it seemed he could still use it, which made both him and the girl very happy. He can use mana that floats in the air, so why can't he use divine power? Uriel said that it was really a shame, but he remains the one whom God chose, and also an incredible magician. So if someone dares to say something to him, he can simply use magical power against him. Iriela seemed to have fallen in love, because she continued to follow him, and maybe it was because of the divine power, but the air around became very pleasant, and even Ray began to smell delicious. This surprised him very much, because he did not understand what she was talking about now. It's a warm scent that makes you want to be close to him, so Ray rolled his eyes and realized that he needed to stay away from her for now, until he learned to control his power. The servants also came to him in the forest to inform him that they wanted to congratulate him on acquiring strength. The guy was happy because he was pleased to see Eucliwood and Zeke together, so he also thanked them for the visit. They said it was a great job, and as soon as they heard about the news, they came right away. Zeke insisted that Ray give him his backpack to carry, and Euclid insisted that she wanted to carry it, and would not mind if Ray gave her more tasks, so he was shocked, because he did not understand what was wrong. They are not like that. He looked at the sky and ordered them to stop as soon as possible, because he wanted to return to his mansion and not waste time on these meaningless things. He looked at Zeke and asked why he was constantly following him. But he said that, as a member of 3 families, it was his duty to serve the guy anywhere and anytime, so he would never change his principles, and he would never have bad intentions. All this was really suspicious, so in the mansion, Ray continued to sit in his room at night and wondered when it would end. He looked at the stack of books and wanted to look at them all, because when he became a saint, he promised himself to make the great kingdom the greatest. So he began to read, and since he was now officially a saint, he needed to fulfill his promise. And first of all, he needs to learn more about the kingdom and its history. So in order to understand all these nuances, he had to turn to books for help. He was very happy because he figured out what could be done, because in order to lead the Holy Kingdom, he would create a completely new system. As soon as the sun rose, Ray called all the nobles of the Holy Kingdom to the mansion to criticize them for not working efficiently enough. Therefore, due to this, he proposed adjustments for agriculture, commerce, and trade. Among them was Mill's solar system, which was intended for the agricultural industry. Ray spoke so confidently that he received enormous support from the nobles, so the first technology was approved very quickly. But Count Train was a little worried, so he turned to Ray, informing him that among the things that are written here, there are still incomprehensible points, because what does it mean to use priests as mercenaries? But he smiled and said that this is indeed true. The whole point is to send priests as mercenaries. Was Ray really suggesting that he send his priests into battle? Yes, everything is absolutely true. At this moment, the others also began to realize the whole situation, because the fall of the priests will lead to the fall of the nation. In addition, the number of people striving to become priests will decrease. Ray reassured them, because of course the priests would not stand on the front line. They would all be in the rear of the battle, while the wounded at the fronts are brought to the priests. In this way, they have the opportunity to avoid casualties among them. But the nobles did not fully understand this, because, in any case, it is always very dangerous on the battlefield, especially if enemies attack from all flanks. Ray understood this and completely agreed with them, because the battlefield is indeed not a safe place. But with a good strategy, all the priests will return to their families alive. Naturally, he will not send them into battle without a plan, so there will always be paladins near them. With this alignment, their priests will be completely safe. But there is one caveat. Using them as mercenaries is a completely different strategy. If they win without their intervention, that's good. But if they lose, then you'll have to use them as backup. Seeing those who were wounded on the battlefield, as well as witnessing the action up close, must be a truly good experience for the priests. However, the nobleman was not entirely sure of this. Of course, they are indeed a necessary force in battle, but are there really no other options? All for the sake of victory and getting money and glory. But Ray interrupted him and said that using priests as mercenaries is not just money and their honor, but just a nice bonus. He smiled and said that they would send priests to the battlefield, and in return they would receive power. Although the interlocutors did not understand what exactly he meant when he said the word power. From the point of view of the peoples who need the help of the Holy Empire, they cannot do anything that could endanger them, and as long as they occupy their troops, they will be able to ask for compensation for the sacrifices made on our part. The interlocutor also thought about this, because it is indeed true. They will have more opportunities to gain control as soon as they begin to allocate their forces. But still, isn't it too dangerous? Uriel also chimed in, saying that, despite the risk, she also thought it was a good idea. So she raised her hand and said that she agreed with the saint's ideas, because they are always great. However, she is also sure that the idea of hired priests will cause some backlash. Ray was a little worried, so he asked if this was true. Then could they somehow win the favor of the nobility? But Iriel calmed him down, telling him that there was no need to worry, since she would be happy to help him with this. She put her hand on the table and said that there was no point in winning favor, and all they need is the words, "Oh, the most beautiful girl in the Holy Empire. Please help me, Lady Uriel." Ray smiled and had a good laugh, and also noted that the influence that Uriel has is very unusual, so it would not be an exaggeration to say that all the high-ranking nobles are supporters of Uriel. He looked at her again and thought that if she really helped him in this situation, then it would be difficult for everyone to object. This was the best way out, so he had no other ideas at all. In the meeting room, Ray said that they were done for today, so if anyone has other ideas regarding the promotion of the Holy Kingdom, then feel free to tell them. Most agreed with him because they thought his ideas were very good. The Holy Empire slowly improved all of its activities, but it was difficult to completely change the farming method. So they started with a small plot of land for the sake of experimentation. And the public turned out to be not at all against the use of priests as mercenaries, after they received consent from the priests themselves. A lot of letters of help appeared, where people asked them for help from hired priests, so thanks to this function, the Holy Kingdom was able to collect a lot of funds. Ray was happy because his ideas really helped the Holy Kingdom improve their quality of life. But even though everything was more or less in order now, they would still need specialists in various fields. And this would be a very difficult task to think about. Ray spent all his free time in the library, looking for answers to his questions. The librarian also seemed very tired, so the new visitor decided to cheer her up a little. She immediately rose from her chair and was delighted, because Lady Ecklet had really returned so quickly. Yes, she said that she was gone for a while. 3 whole months have already passed since their last meeting. How quickly time flies. It was very strange for her to see so many people in the library, since it was usually empty, so she asked why there were so many of them here. The librarian smiled and said that the saint had been visiting her for several days. Saint? Yes, it was he. Even at that moment, Ray continued to sit and read the book. It seems that everyone fell in love with him, doesn't it? Therefore, the girl came closer to him and moved a chair near his desk, which surprised him quite a lot, because Ray did not plan to see anyone now. She smiled and greeted him, asking if he was really the new saint. He agreed and asked what she wanted, and he was also haunted by questions. Who is she, and why does she communicate with him as with a friend? She took one of these books and asked if they were all devoted to medicine now, and had he really read all of them? She began to openly laugh at him, asking if he really managed to remember anything from this. He agreed. Of course it was successful, to some extent. Ecklet continued to laugh, so she asked the guy how to treat a cut from a rusty knife. Ray thought about it and said that she could prevent the symptoms of poisoning if she used holy medicine, after which the wound would heal. She said it was right, but does he himself agree with it? Ray replied, no. So she looked at him and asked what he was going to do then to cure the patient. Ray said he would make an incision around the infected flesh. But why? The answer is simple, because everyone thinks that getting cut by a rusty knife is tantamount to poisoning. But this cannot be said. No one will be poisoned by a rusty sword. But around the cut site, an infection can enter the cells. So, it is impossible to cure this perfectly using holy healing, so it would be much better to remove the infected area around the cut and heal the area itself. Ecklet looked at him and asked, what kind of cells he mentioned earlier. But Ray forgot that in this world people don't yet know about the cells in the body. So the girl looked at him and said that maybe these cells he was talking about could not be healed with holy medicine. But wouldn't it be too barbaric to cut out the affected area? Ray agreed with her, but said that this was the only correct way out of such a situation. Eklit leaned back in her chair, because she realized that as long as they could cure the patient, the method itself would not be so important, but Ray did not quite mean that. She put another hand on the table and stood up, saying that she liked the guy, which shocked him very much, because no one had ever allowed him to behave like that in the presence of Ray. After which, she smiled and invited the guy to go to her laboratory, where they could discuss even more interesting points together. She also looked at the fallen book and apologized for not introducing herself. Her name is Eklit, and she had already begun to announce her position, but Ray interrupted her. He couldn't believe his eyes. Could this really be Eklit? She's the manager of the priests, so is she really the high priest? And despite the fact that they met for the first time, the girl heard about the guy even before she got to this castle. So if he needed any medical help, he could call at any time. Though, to be honest, she didn't really understand why a saint was studying useless medicine. Before him stood a huge number of different books, and all this was in the girl's laboratory. Apparently, she is also studying medicine, although she says it is useless. Eklit still hoped that this would help her cure one long-standing illness. Ray looked at her and said that this is something innate, isn't it? She felt very funny. It was a defensive reaction, because how was he not surprised after seeing this? That's why he said that she had this sore since birth. Ray asked if she was blind in one eye and could she feel pain? Eklit replied that she was not in pain, but she still could not see. Ray noticed a huge number of books on medicine, which were even more numerous than in the library. If she would mind if he looked at all this more closely, after which she gave him a look. These were symptoms noticeably similar to cataracts. He said that it was she, but in this world people did not know what it was, so Eklit was very scared and began to ask Ray what it was. But he was not yet completely sure, so he began to ask whether the girl could see in the dark. She replied that she really could see a little better at night. So Ray was convinced that it was a cataract and was ready to explain everything to her. So he asked her to look at what he was now drawing. This is the pupil, and next to it the lens. When she looks somewhere, the lens focuses on the light, thereby allowing us to see better. But in her case, the lens is very clouded, and this disease is called cataract. She looked at him and asked that if he was telling the truth, then what should she do? If it's a disease, can't it be cured by healing? Maybe it's because the girl was originally born with cataracts. But what if the healing doesn't work? Ray looked at her and said that divine power eliminates disorders in the body and heals them. But what if the divine power does not accept this as a violation? Perhaps for this reason she is unable to heal. But this is a violation, because Eklit has only one-sided eye. This is from the point of view of other people. Maybe from the moment of her birth, the body does not understand that something is wrong? In any case, the girl should clean her lens to cure the cataract. But she did not understand how this could be done. Ray looked at her and said that she needed to cut out the problem area, but still panicked a little, because she did not understand how in this world this could be done without precision tools. Eklit started screaming at him, because does he really want to say that she needs to cut out her eye? But Ray said that's just part of the operating process. First of all, you need to get rid of the clouded lens and replace it with something else. Although he thought about it and decided that it could be simply removed because there is no artificial lens in this world, he continued to say, because even if they get rid of the cataract, there is no point in this, since she will not be able to restore her vision. Eklit smiled and bowed her head, saying that there was no need to worry about her incurable illness. She was sure that in a couple of years he would be able to find a way. These words hurt her very much, because did she really say right now that Ray would not be able to cope with this task? Even if this is another world, won't it really be able to cure cataracts? He looked at Eklet and ordered her not to worry, as he would definitely help her. She liked this approach much better, so she smiled and looked at the new saint with pride. A second later, she burst out laughing very hard, because she couldn't believe it. So she started laughing at the guy and saying that he was really very funny. But still, she told him that she agreed to treatment and invited him to follow her, to show him something. This was her laboratory where she spent most of her time. She was founded by the Holy Kingdom, so that she could study medicine. So she told Ray to feel at home and take whatever he wanted. His happiness knew no bounds. He could not believe it. But the girl said that she was lonely here anyway, so this is the least she can do for someone who is really interested in medicine. Ray thanked her and every day began to study the girl's illness, almost without getting out of the laboratory. A month later, he already had several prepared test tubes on his shelves, which he tested. He took one of them and began to examine the troll's blood. After contact with air after a short period of time, the blood changes its consistency. And while he was saying all this, she had already become hard, like a piece of jelly. But the blood of different monsters has its own characteristics. Does he really think that, from a medical point of view, it will be useful to them? Ray thought about it, because it looks like she will most likely really suit them. He was a little scared, so he wanted to ask the girl if it was really impossible to mix the blood of different monsters with each other. She said that this is true, because each monster has its own different blood composition. But there is one exception. Unlike other species, in the case of orcs, due to their great adaptability, they can be mixed with other blood. These words made the guy think, so he began to think what good adaptability means, and is it possible to somehow test it? It was already getting dark outside, and the whole kingdom was getting ready for bed. But the guy still continued to walk through the forest in search of medicine. He was really very tired, so he began to wipe his forehead, deciding that that was enough for today, and that he should also go to bed. Something unique near him, but what was it? Was there really an orc and a troll next to him now, and both of them were dead, and what if they had just fought? It's like a gift from fate. He glanced at the troll, who was still alive. He noticed a large wound on his body, and realized that he was now in a state of shock, because he was bleeding. However, it was surprising that he survived after fighting an orc that was twice his size. Now it was the turn to look at the orc, who was lying exhausted. Ray immediately remembered the girl's words. Unlike other species, in the case of orcs, due to their high adaptability, they can be mixed with other blood. He immediately stuck out his tongue and smiled, because this is really a great chance to test all these hypotheses. So if he seizes the moment, he can save him. The troll continued to lie and moan from impotence. But he was a little surprised when Ray connected a blood transfusion machine to his veins. All this time, the guy was near him and noticed how the troll woke up and was very scared, so Ray tried to calm him down. But he immediately rushed to the attack, frightening the guy, who asked him only to stay in place and not move at all. Therefore, in order to protect himself and save the blood transfusion machine, Ray used a numb spell and stopped the monster in place. He waved his hands and asked him to calm down, because he did not want to harm him, but on the contrary, he was trying to help him, since he had lost too much blood, so he transfused him with some of it from the orc. He woke up too quickly, so he never had time to finish, but Ray was even more surprised by the fact that the wound on his body began to shrink very quickly. He looked at the blood and didn't understand why it was like that. Had it really just cleared up? Ray waved his hands and was very happy, because it was just perfect. If it worked here, then now he will definitely succeed in public. Ray looked at this place and understood that it was exactly this place that Eklet had told him about. When he transferred the blood of an orc into a troll, it became very pure and pliable for use. So he was very surprised, because he could not even imagine that such a wonderful result could be achieved. It dawned on him that thanks to this method he would finally be able to create his own artificial lens and cure Eklit. He was serious, so he understood that now he first of all needed to get as much blood as possible from trolls and orcs. He wondered where he could find so much blood for his research. Eklit decided that she could solve this issue, so she said that not far from the laboratory, there was an abandoned village, and next to it, in the surrounding forests, there was a place where orcs and trolls were quite common. She looked quite scary, like in horror films. Therefore, Ray immediately went there in search, and was worried. Because this village used to belong to the village of Hegel, but the girl definitely did not lie when she said that the village was really abandoned. Suddenly, something fell very hard, making a rather unpleasant sound, which really scared the guy. He turned his head and saw children there. But what were they doing in this abandoned city? Were they also abandoned and left here to die? Ray came closer to them and said hello, but the guy put his hand on the girl, making it clear that he would be ready to fight if he dared to attack. But Ray just offered them something to eat, giving them some meat. The guy was scared and worried, so Ray calmed him down, saying that the food is quite normal and not poisoned, so it can be safely consumed. He smiled because he was pleased that at least they trusted him. That's why he reached into his bag, because he understood that the only thing he could do now was to help them, at least giving them a little more food. He looked at the children and offered them something else. After they opened the bag, they were very shocked when they saw a huge amount of gold coins. Ray smiled and ordered them to spend this money on the road to Salonia, because there they would already be able to provide for themselves and find food. But the children did not understand why he was so kind to them. He laughed and said that no reason was needed for this, even if he was seeing them for the first time. The children didn't believe him at all, so he continued to reassure them, saying that he really didn't need any reasons. Just to think, this happened as soon as he left the capital. He understood that the current laws did not provide for this at all, so he would need to deal with this issue as soon as he came to the Holy Kingdom. He looked at these ruins, saying that one day he would restore the glory of this place, in order to make the Holy Kingdom a much better place. The next morning, we had to continue our journey. Therefore, Ray was already on his feet in the morning and went to a large cave. He was a little scared, because he understood that it was quite huge, so perhaps the orcs lived in it. Therefore, you need to be as careful as possible and try not to wake them up. Ray got as close to him as possible from behind, but was still a little nervous. He took out a syringe and apologized to the troll in advance, because he would need to steal something from him. He laughed and said that he would just take some blood from him. After which he came to a village where there seemed to be a huge number of trolls in tents. They were very surprised by his appearance, so they began to grunt, not understanding what was happening. Ray came closer to them and asked them to do a small favor. This made them very angry and surprised, since they were not used to seeing strangers on their land. Therefore, the strongest of them immediately rushed into battle, which made Ray laugh very much, since they did not want to listen to him at all. When he received no response, he waved his hand and immediately used a grappling technique to stop them. He pointed his finger at his opponent and said that it was definitely him. Didn't he really remember how Ray saved his life in the forest? So he stopped and waved his hand, telling him to just stop and listen to him. All Ray needs is to do a favor for him, for which he will repay him well. After meeting them, it was time to go back. Ray walked and was happy holding the test tube in his hands, because thanks to the orcs he was able to test some things today. But first, when he returns, he will need to use everything that he collected. Suddenly, someone in front of him took a step towards him with his boot. This surprised Ray very much, so he also stopped and asked, "Is it really you again?" The girl ran up to him and was in tears, so she grabbed the guy by the clothes and pointed in that direction. At that moment, her brother began to be beaten and thrown against the wall. It was the villain with the bat who took all the money from him and laughed and asked if he now understood why he had to politely give it back when he asked. But the guy didn't give up and started shouting back at him, ordering him to return the money back. Another villain's partner approached him and asked what this boy allows himself. Is it really not enough for him? Therefore, he swung his bat and decided to hit him several more times for daring to object to him. Luckily, Ray arrived in time to help, so he grabbed the bat and ordered an immediate stop, which surprised the robber. Therefore, the robber jumped away from him and turned his head towards him, after which he decided to ask who he was. They began to analyze the guy and what he looked like. Ray noticed his wallet with the money that they stole from the guy, but he couldn't believe it a little. But everything fell into place when the robbers pulled out weapons and surrounded Ray, because he had a large bag that they wanted to take for themselves. But they also asked if he didn't think that walking here alone was not a good decision at all. The main one began to laugh, saying that now he would teach him a lesson. At this moment, they also began to attack him from behind. Ray was absolutely calm, so he didn't even look in his direction and put out his hand, hitting the enemy with it and inviting the main one to attack. He was shocked by the guy's skill, because he didn't even understand how this was possible. But what exactly? Ray asked if he was really interested in how he knocked him out with one blow. Therefore, he smiled and said that he would not mind continuing. The robbers took out weapons and rushed into battle, asking if he really thinks that everything in life is so simple. A few seconds later, all the attackers were disposed of and lay unconscious on the ground. The children united at this moment and hugged each other tightly. Ray smiled and looked at them, asking if everything was okay with them. He also apologized to them for what happened. Ray took the children with him and invited them to the Holy Kingdom. But the maid was clearly against this, as she said that the mansion is a holy place in which only saints, as well as their servants, can live. Since they don't know who these children are, so they cannot let them in. Is it really impossible to do this, even if the saint living here allows them? Can't only 2 children fit in such a big place? But Euclid said those are the rules. Ray was shocked because he couldn't even think that there were such strict rules here. He didn't even know. But he looked at the guys and smiled, asking them not to worry, because if they couldn't live here, he could find them another place to live. Do you like it? The children were shocked by such an act. Ray just came and bought them a house, but he was very surprised, because he didn't even ask them what their names were. So he looked at them and decided to ask, but the children shocked him, because they still didn't have names. This shocked him, so he looked at the guy first and began to come up with some interesting name for him. Ray remembered Christmas and laughed because he had just made a decision. So he said that the girl would be called Mary and the guy would be called Chris, since they had a very good meaning from the place he came from. The children stood in bewilderment and did not say anything. So Ray smiled and asked if they didn't like the names. No problem, he can come up with something else. But the guy put his hands on his sister's shoulders and said that this was not at all true. He just didn't know what to say because he was very grateful to him. Ray was very pleased to realize that he was also able to help children. They ran up to him and wanted to hug him tightly for what he did for them, thanking him for all this. But there wasn't much time, so it was necessary to continue working in the mansion. Ray still continues to sit and study all the necessary materials because he needed to come up with a cure for cataracts. Euclid approached him and asked if he was still working on it. She didn't understand what he was going to do, since he sits at work for days on end. But Ray asked her to just wait, because he just wants to help her. Finally, he managed to create an artificial lens, which began to glow magically blue. Euclid decided to find out exactly how Ray wants to help her. Because he talked about curing her eye? Has he really abandoned this idea? He raised his glasses and said that, of course, he knew how to help her. So he showed her the test tube and said that, thanks to this, he could cure her eye. But she was shocked by this, because did he really think that it would help? She looked at the guy and asked what it was and where he could find it. But the guy confidently told her that it was troll blood. But after studying hundreds of books, she couldn't understand how the blood could become so pure. So Ray explained to her that he simply mixed it with orc blood. As Eklet said, orcs are able to adapt to anything. Unlike other species, although Ray learned this by pure chance, while the orc's body can accept blood, during the purification process it becomes pure. That is why he mixed the blood of an orc with the blood of a troll. This is amazing because they can produce clear blood that is still malleable to manipulation. She asked Ray again if it would really help her heal her eye. But he simply asked her to trust and said that everything would be fine. Ray showed her the lens and told her that he would only have to put it on his eye in order to heal it. Eklat was shocked and started screaming, because at first he said that he was going to cut out this cataract. But now he says that he wants to pour this blood on her eye? So Ray looked at her and tried to reassure her, because, technically speaking, they cut out the parts of the lens that were affected, and then they will put it in as a replacement for what was cut out. He looked at Eklet and understood that most likely she needed time to think about it, because, after all, she could not even imagine that something like that could be possible. So Ray looked at her and tried to convince her with his eyes of this decision. Then he bent down, making it clear that he respects her and is ready to help if she allows. She was shocked and started screaming, because doesn't he understand what it means for a saint to bow his head? Ray tried to convince her and said that he understood that it was difficult for him to believe, because it sounded between something unreal and impossible. So he asked her to trust, because he would do everything possible to cure her eye. Eklet was shocked, because he spoke quite convincingly. She continued to look at the guy and felt the sincerity in every word of this child, who was really trying to help her, and it sounded very convincing. She felt sincerity in his every word, although she herself understood that this was madness. Therefore, she smiled and kindly agreed to this, because this is already the last hope for her cure. So if there is even the slightest chance of success, then she will grab it. A little later, she was already lying on the operating table, where Ray was preparing everything necessary for the operation. He decided to use mana to keep the girl's eyelids open all the time. And by making an incision in the lens, he is going to remove all the affected areas. And then, after removing the entire affected area, he will replace it with a new artificial lens. But although the procedure is not at all complicated, there are still some nuances. At least there is no professional equipment here, but it is also not difficult for him to do everything manually. After all, don't forget who he is, because in a past life, he was Park Yu-sung, a brilliant doctor in the world, who was called the Hands of God. After some time, the girl began to open her eyes and come out of anesthesia. Ray looked at her and asked how she was feeling, because her new eye looked really good. She began to be very surprised, because her eye was beginning to make itself felt. Eklet looked to the side, trying to examine the entire room in which she was. She looked out the window and noticed how much better she saw. She even had tears flowing, which means that the eye is functioning normally. Ray noticed this and smiled, asking how the girl was feeling. Was everything okay? He wondered how she was all this healing process. She cried with happiness and smiled, saying that she was completely fine and saw really very well. She couldn't believe it, so she asked him if this was really not a dream. But the guy just smiled. They looked out the window together and rejoiced at the pleasant view and the fact that they had succeeded after so much work. But everything could not be so good for a long time, because someone was already rushing for help. A nobleman ran up to the saint in a panic and said that they now had an emergency situation. A huge army gathered at the borders and was about to march towards the Holy Kingdom. Ariel did not understand what he was talking about, so she wanted to find out more information. What kind of army? How many are there? And how far are they located? But he leaned over from fatigue and said that, for now, this is all the information that was reported to him. But it seems that they are not from any particular nation. Ariel was shocked because it seemed that this army had been assembled by a necromancer, and it was heading straight towards them. Not far from the kingdom, there were terrible magical clouds that were moving towards the kingdom. Even a simple flower that grew in the forest could no longer do this, since it was already destroyed by the monster with its metal leg, around which there was magic. A few seconds later, everything in the forest was covered with a purple curtain that inspired fear. A terrifying army of a necromancer was approaching the Holy Kingdom, who gathered all his strongest fighters in order to enslave all the inhabitants of the kingdom. There was no time to hesitate, so a state of emergency was immediately declared. Tomorrow will finally be a day of holy war. Are all preparations ready? With the paladins at the front, all guardsmen and knights will protect rear. Many lives are at stake, so make sure you prepare yourself mentally before battle. The knights began to discuss all this because they still can't believe they're about to face the undead. What are you looking at? It's times like this when I have thoughts about my family. Rather than praying to God, I thought that my family first as well. I should have made the trip to see them before I came here. Same, praying to God was the last thing I thought of. I happened to hear this from the officers, but it seems that the new saint is joining us in combat. Really? Are you talking about the one who can use meteor? However, it'll take 4 days straight to walk all the way from Salonia to here. That's right. Seems like it's a matter of if we can hold the line until the saint arrives.